Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Madisha Kure, and welcome to Between the Brackets. Between the Brackets is a live video series we run every month discussing various Google technologies. Before I get into the topic this month and introduce you to the panel, there's a few housekeeping items that I want to highlight. Number one, if you haven't subscribed to our mailing list or to our events page, the link is below. Make sure to subscribe. And if you're tuning in from either YouTube, LinkedIn, or Twitter, give this video a like, a share, a thumbs up, and encourage your network to join in the future series as well. And you can also find our playlists available on our website. That being said, today's session is around fairness and ethics in AI, a perspective from journalism, medicine, and translation. Remember, since this session is live, we can take live questions. So if you're tuning in from either one of those platforms, make sure to send us your questions and we'll try to get them answered accordingly. In today's panel, we have Kalev Leetaru, who is a Google developer expert. He's also the founder of the Genome Project. Samuel Marks, who's a Google developer expert as well. He's a research fellow at the Harvard Medical School. And then we have Mallika Iyer, who's joining us from Google's AI team, translation and AI team, and she's the head of product management there. So that being said, I'd like to bring our panelists on the screen. Welcome.
Hey.
So I know I give a quick introduction, but how about we go around the room a little bit more and explain what you all do on a day-to-day basis and where these perspectives that we're going to discuss are coming from. Kalev.
So I'm Kalev Leetaru. I created the Genome Project. The Genome Project is an open data project that focuses on basically trying to understand planet Earth. So essentially we monitor news media from across the world with a real focus on local media around the world, over 150 languages, imagery, video, audio, et cetera, from across the planet. And one of the challenges there and the real relevance to today's panel really comes around the globalization of AI, of how do we adapt AI tools so that they work equally well across the entire world and deal with a lot of these questions of bias and fairness that really come about when we try to use machines to understand global events, narratives, and emotions.
And very quickly, I think we had multiple discussions around what you're doing. It was very interesting how you were able to look at the trend of COVID happening in the beginning. How much data are you processing in a given day?
And that's a great example there, actually. Genome was actually used to send out one of the very first alerts, actually, of COVID-19. Our data was used, actually, by a group that processes that. And so, yeah, so that's one of the things. So we monitor today 150 languages, soon, actually, to be almost 400. We're really, really expanding across the world. And it really depends. I mean, today we bring in, news media, at least 1 million URLs a day on a typical day. A lot of the stuff we can't process yet because a lot of the tooling does not exist yet for a lot of the world's languages. And this is one of those things that we're very interested in is how do we essentially take what oftentimes is very English-centric tooling and really expand that across the world's languages and across imagery. I mean, weddings, for example, look very different around the world. Models that are trained on what a wedding might look like to a particular group may not reflect, in fact, very much does not reflect the world. So how do we adapt these tools to really allow us to see the world through others' eyes? And yeah, and television and audio, it's an enormous amount. I think altogether, GDALT right now is about 8.5 trillion data points and climbing very rapidly.
Wow. Mallika.
Hi, my name is Mallika Iyer. I am the head of product in cloud for translation. So I lead all of our initiatives in translation within Google Cloud Platform. I've been in Google for quite some time now. Translation is an area that is extremely interesting personally to me because the output of translation directly reveals our collective human bias that has gone into the training set. And as we talk more today, I'll talk a little bit about that. But the ethics in AI and bias in AI, to me, it's very much a reflection of bias in humanity collectively that comes into our data and then reflects back to us via AI.
That's awesome. Sam, you want to give us a quick overview?
Sure. So I've got a computer science degree, a PhD in medicine, working my second PhD, and I'm doing my separately from that, I'm doing my research fellowship, like postdoc at Harvard Medical School in Mass Eye and Ear Infirmary. I kind of come from this from a different perspective. I think all my research is about mass screening primarily for glaucoma, which is a blinding eye disease, and I look at discussions in the ethics and AI topic, and it's just very much missing the point, at least in my humble opinion. People are not worried about how do we reduce blindness. They're worried about how do we prevent my neighbor from knowing that my eye is in that same database. And really what I want to get across today is that it's okay to be biased. It's okay to be specific more to one set of inalienable traits than another. And the reason it's fine to do this is because biology does have meaning. And by removing biology from the equation, by saying, okay, someone walks into the clinic, I'm going to ignore their age, their gender, their ethnicity, their family history. It's like, well, okay, you might be able to treat some people that way, but you're missing the boat. Whereas if you're specific, if you're like, okay, you're of this race and this gender, and you're in this age range, oh, you've got a really high risk of going blind. I want to see you every 6 months, not every 2 years. I want to see you every 3 months. I want to see you like every week. This doesn't look good. Stay overnight. And that's kind of the big thing in the kind of bias discussion that people are ignoring. That bias is not always, but when it's scientific, bias is quote unquote good.
Okay, so thank you so much for the intros. And I'm looking at the live stream. We have close to 150 people tuning in live. Don't be shy to put your questions in, and we'll try to get them answered accordingly. Anything you want us to clarify, and over to you, Kalev.
Me?
Yeah, no, I mean, let's start it off with what you were talking about a little earlier.
Yeah, boy, it's always scary being the first. So yeah, I mean, what's fascinating in the journalism world is, so much of, if you take just natural, if you take just text, so much of the tooling that exists today is very English centric. It's either exclusively English, or you see, some of the major European languages represented there. But as you start to look beyond, so like take a simple example of language detection. Language detection tools today, they're good, maybe 80 or so languages. You've got fairly decent results. As you go past that, it really starts to break down. As you really walk past about 150 or 200 languages, even the ability to know, well, what language is this written in, really, really trails off. And so even the idea of knowing, well, what language am I working in to be able to, be able to do a lot of those downstream tasks. So one of the things in journalism is this, at least so there's actually two interesting parts of this. So one is the analytic piece of this, of when I receive a news article. So you can imagine, Jidal, we're essentially this fire hose of news pouring in from across the world, whether that's still imagery, whether that's video, whether that's spoken audio, and whether that's text, this fire hose coming in. So part of that, the first task really is to understand, well, and what's interesting too, even in video, here in the US, we turn on CNN and we know that what we're going to hear is either in English or overdubbed into English. In very multilingual societies, that is not the case. And in fact, one of our collaborations with the Internet Archive actually is looking ever more at television across the world and understanding how does television news vary. And there you see a lot of code switching. You see same speakers speaking multiple languages rapidly, sometimes different words in different languages, all completely fluently, because that is just that society. But that creates real challenges. Our AI tools today, a lot of the sort of the production state-of-the-art tools are not good at language just really rapidly varying through there. Even here in the US, we'll see, for example, a Taliban broadcast being aired or something else coming in. There's a lot of challenges in that. But then conversely, journalism has a lot to teach us about training data. So, these AI tools, as Mallika was saying, like one of the real challenges is that training data that powers these tools. And there's been kind of a movement towards, instead of just harvesting, a lot of the tooling is just sort of harvesting from the web what you get your hands on, which tends to be extremely biased. So there has been a lot of focus on specifically hand-curated collections. One of the challenges is that there are in certain quarters a movement towards using journalistic data to say, well, news data that's highly curated. When I speak on television news, for example, that speech was written by one layer, it went to another layer, another layer. There's so many layers of editorial control. But one of the things we actually just released a series last week, actually looking at pronouns on television news and showing that both in the US and Europe, the male-related pronouns are used at twice the rate of female-related pronouns. And in fact, if you look across channels, whether that's CNN, MSNBC, Fox, BBC News, and others, density of female pronouns are actually equal across all these channels. Where they vary as male pronouns, that's huge because that tells us that just the sort of the referentials that are being used there, and maybe even the topic of news itself, skews very heavily. And same thing, we look at group-based discourse. Is it about me and I versus those and they and them? All these vary. So even within the world of journalism, these biases are manifest. They're existential biases. So they tell us that no matter what we use here, we're going to have these issues. And what does that mean essentially to this idea of how do we kind of try to move away from these biases in our training data?
Madhusha, mind if I?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So Kalev brings a very, very interesting point, and Sam alluded to this earlier as well. To me, there are two ways of looking at bias in AI. There is the very philosophical way of looking at it and going, hey, bias is not good, because when you think about bias, you're thinking about, by default, there is a negative meaning to it. And there is, you think about, hey, you're by default inclined against an idea or against a person or a thing. And this means that the outcome is very likely going to be unfair. And there is the practical way of looking at it from a very, very product perspective. As in, when you think about bias in AI, I have to ask the question. I urge everyone to step back and ask the question, what are you building and who are you building it for? Because that influences everything. Because no matter what, my personal experiences shape what I'm going to do and the way I'm going to think. And there are systemic biases in pretty much everything. If there was something that was built for us, then it's very likely that it was built by someone like us, who thought like us. And very likely it is going to exclude large groups of users. So when I think about that in terms of translation, as an example, and this still tends to happen in some languages, and again, to a large extent, it is a factor of the training data, but the training data is a reflection of our society as a whole. So, for example, depending on which language you translate from and which language you translate to, if you take the example of the doctor asked the nurse to help, or the doctor asked the nurse for help. Now, if you translate it to a different language, it's anyone's guess. Is it going to be the translation over there? Is that going to be is the translation going to treat the nurse as a female or a male? That depends on, because in the English language the gender might not come through, but in other languages the gender might, and there might be an implication, or it might be implied that nurse is always female and a doctor is always male. And that could be a reflection of the fact that historically, that's because of how society was and how education was accessible. That's what it was. And that is a factor of what was historically the case. But at the same time, so in this case, we should actively work to mitigate these kind of biases from the product. But in the case where Samuel mentioned, where having the information that a certain kind of disease is more prevalent again within a certain race, or within a certain demographic, that information is important, so that if you're going to use AI to help you to treat a certain kind of condition, not everyone is equally, disease doesn't target everyone equally depending on what kind of disease it is. And this is even more so for genetic conditions. So yeah.
To follow on from that point, Mallika used the word unfair, and fairness, AI, ethics. A lot of these words are just fairness and ethics that are used quite a bit, along with bias. I don't think these words, and kind of your remarks about translation, saying when you translate it maybe to French or Portuguese or one of these other languages, that when you're talking about the nurse always has by default has the female pronouns. There's a whole lot of sociological theory that is obviously part of this conversation. I think the best thing to do is to reflect reality rather than someone's theory, and reality is biology does make a difference. And yes, it's unfair that more Africans have glaucoma than Caucasians. That's really unfair. I agree. But it is reality. And a lot of news, a lot of public health broadcasts kind of ignore reality, or worse, they purposefully fight against reality because of some sociological theory they're trying to push. I'm a scientist. I live in reality, and I think it's very important that we, in these discussions and in the algorithms that we write, reflect reality rather than some sort of social engineering. Wouldn't it be nice if reality was like this? Wouldn't it be nice if Africans had the same glaucoma rate? Glaucoma is my field, as Caucasians. Yeah, that would be great, but it's not reality. And the first chapter of my first doctorate was about a glaucoma risk calculator that I think I had 13 different ethnicities, and it's all open source on GitHub. It had something like 13 different ethnicities, and based on which ethnicity you were, all the risk profile was different. So if you're Japanese, you have a very high risk. If you're Caucasian from German descent, you have a different risk than Caucasian from I don't remember the other ethnicity offhand, but I had something like 6 different Caucasian ethnicities that were listed. So it's just very important. Chinese living in urban areas had a different rate to Chinese living in rural areas. So just what I'm trying to get across is that bias can be a reflection of reality. When it's not a reflection of reality, then I agree we should fight it. But when it is a reflection of reality, we should reinforce it, because that can give us insights and make our models more accurate. So whether we're translating from one language to another, or whether we're diagnosing a disease from an image or from medical history, or from a combination of the two, it gives us better accuracy. And at the end of the day, we're all computer scientists here. We're all building statistical models here. Wouldn't you rather have a lower false positive rate and a higher true, the entire, false positives, false negatives, true positives, true negatives? Don't you want your F1 score to be improved?
And I love, actually, I think there's a fascinating kind of counterpart, like Mallika, like what you said is it's really not about bias, it's about fairness. And I think that's kind of a perfect way of pulling this together, because like in my world where we're trying to use machines to understand news, we want to come away with the correct understanding, no matter what the language is, no matter where it comes from across the world. We want to be able to understand it accurately and correctly. Versus, and in translation, you want to remove a lot of those systemic biases that are there, a nurse and so on. But in medicine, fairness actually, the conceptualization of fairness, Samuel, like from what you're saying, is really that idea of fairness here is to reinforce those biases because they have a difference in treatment, essentially how we treat it. So you think about it in journalism, the idea of fairness is language, really these underlying issues should not play a role. I should be able to take an article and understand it regardless of where it came from and what form it came from. In translation, we want to remove a lot of these historical systemic biases that creep through in our language and can undermine and have really negative societal conflicts today, or components today. And then in medicine, though, it's actually kind of the opposite. And that's a really, I think, fascinating Mallika, that you had, is really that notion of bias versus fairness, and that these can actually sometimes not be one and the same, combating those two.
Yeah, because it goes to the foundational point, right? Who is it being built for, and what is the problem that it is trying to solve? Because even within journalism, if I read an article, unless it's presented in an extremely factual way, if I read an article and you read the same article, we could very well come away with slightly different conclusions. And depends, is that the intent? Then, that's fine. If I think of a social media example, there are a number of social media platforms today where users can be entrepreneurs in their own right, and they can make a significant amount of money, grow their user base, what have you. Now, there is, at this point, there is an implied contract between the platform of choice and the user, where the users are expecting that I trust this platform that I am betting my livelihood on, and I trust the platform to do the right thing. Now, if this kind, I'll take a simple example. If this kind of, if a platform, any social media platform, for example, where you share pictures or videos or what have you, if the algorithm powering it tends to favor more pictures where you show skin, or more pictures, or more videos where there is very controversial kind of topics, and there's a tremendous amount of user engagement as a result of that. Now, at that point, depends. Would you say that this platform has failed all of its users? Because now, is it going to push the user base towards the kind of behavior that this platform favors in order for users to get more likes or more engagement, and therefore have a better user presence? Or is it going to kind of be able to take feedback from their user base and learn that, hey, we're doing something wrong here, this is really not what we are trying to promote, and this is a situation where AI can learn from its mistakes? Because again, whoever created it and whoever wrote it, there is a bias somewhere that's creeped in, and it could be negative or it could be positive. Again, that depends on what that social platform was intended for. So even in the same example of, let's say, you take any social media platform, you can have bias being a bad thing or a good thing depending on what it was intended to do. It's not that everything is supposed to solve for everything else. We quite simply just cannot take what applies to a general conversation and apply it to, say, medicine, because someone's preferred pronouns may be they them, but in medicine it actually matters. And Samuel can keep me honest here, but I would imagine it actually matters if someone is by birth male or female, because that's going to impact how you're treated. So it's not so much as pronouns not mattering, it's just that it will actually actively hinder the prognosis or the diagnosis or the treatment.
Yeah, that's certainly a good point to bring up, and you know, in some fields, not to be too on the nose here, but in some fields the truth matters, in some fields it doesn't. Is kind of what you're saying. I don't want to make any sociological points here. I'm not a sociologist, but to respond to some of the points brought up, and also to respond to what you said earlier, and also to respond to Dan Stormont's question, which was from like 15 minutes ago. Considering race, gender, ethnicity, etc., makes sense for medical treatment, but does that extend to other areas? That seems like the outlier because genetics matter for disease. It does make sense for other areas. If you're selling feminine hygiene products, are you selling them to transgender male to females? Well, probably not. But you are selling them to transgender female to males. You are selling them to females. So from a purely marketing perspective, it's got a market segment, and it wouldn't make sense to not market to that market segment because you're worried about political correctness. A big issue with, and I know political correctness is the buzzword of the day. I don't want to step on toes too much, but the whole idea of what Mallika said earlier, that when you translate nurses to another language, it might use the female pronouns for nurses, even though not every nurse is female. But she also made a sociological point, which is not backed by data, and that is that the reason that there are more women in nursing fields than males in nursing fields is because of systemic bias from population, from I don't want to read too much into it, but that is not actually backed by the literature. The literature is very clear, showing that there are personality differences between men and women, and those personality differences account for a difference in interest in things versus interest in people. And I can send references if people like, but this is all very very quick Google searches away. Like all STEM fields are not created equal. That's a article from 2015 in Sec Development Psychology, and I can share a DUI for that. But there are a number of articles on this post. It's okay, if we're going to make a sociological, biology says one thing, but we want to change society so that it's in a utopian vision, then let's just say that, and let's not pretend it's science. Let's say that we're starting a new religion. It's a utopian religion. Here is, our goal at the end of this utopian religion is everyone is equal in every single aspect. And that's fine, but that's not a scientific goal. That's an anti-scientific goal. Thomas Sowell writes about this extensively. So do many others. It's are we going to be scientists, or are we going to be social pioneers trying to change history so that we're all in the same cubicle as our neighbors, and we all wear the same clothes, and we all none of us win any sport, and everything's just equal, radical egalitarianism. If that's the goal, that's fine, but let's just be clear that that's our bias towards an anti-scientific goal, as opposed to, I'm a scientist, I want to stop people going blind. That's my field. So I want to find the people that are most at risk of going blind, tell them they're going to go blind by using some of my devices and some AI technology, all of which is on my GitHub. I'm starting to CC0 license it, so you don't even need to reference my name. So is that our goal, or is our goal to, well, that's my goal. I don't know what your goal is. I don't speak for anyone but myself.
Well, and I think as Mallika was saying, I think one of the fascinating questions here again is like, what is the end result? If you say in medicine, because if you think about it, it's really about looking at those dimensions that matter most to that specific application. But I think also we have to think of the societal impacts of this. If you think about if I'm building an algorithm to look for cancer and there are biological differences in how that manifests itself, say in a radiological image, then perhaps it does make sense to bring that in because your end goal in that particular case is disease detection. So if you kind of think about like as Mallika was saying, which I think is a fantastic framing to this, it's really about that specific application. If I'm building a cancer detector, then what I want to focus on is what dimensions make that the most accurate. If I'm thinking about, for example, an application, say, of content moderation, for example, there's been a lot of discussion about, for example, what is not allowable, what is content that's bad for society. And, as someone who's worked a lot in that field globally, those sensitivities differ dramatically. And in some countries, things that criticize the government are considered not acceptable in those societies. And so this becomes that question of, well, who defines what those values are? And I think there's a really fascinating difference between sort of medicine where you have that nice, it's like mathematics, you have that nice circumscribed piece of, there is a right answer. If I have an equation, there's a right answer to a mathematical equation. If I'm looking for a disease, there's a right answer. Does the person suffer from this disease or not? But if we look at the application, whether that's sentencing guidelines, whether that is mortgages, whether that is credit ratings, all these different things. And I think one of the challenges that we're confronting here is as AI is kind of moving across society, what should be the end goal of these systems? If you think about automated writing systems now, all of these new tools that will, just basically write flowing prose, let's say that those systems are ingrained that, for example, the president of the United States is always male. Those systems, well, in turn, because historically that has always been the case, you might say, well, mathematically, that's accurate. If they say the president's male, that's mathematically accurate. But I think one of the things now that you're seeing in the AI space is the societal impacts. Because if we say, well, mathematically, that is always the case, statistically, but then you say, well, what is the downstream societal impact if these machines are always reinforcing these stereotypes? And you say, well, what is the impact of an automated writing system? Well, maybe the impact there is societal impact. Similarly, if we looked at, say, a lot of the laws that we have in this country, whether that's about credit, whether it's about a lot of these things, there are a lot of laws that came about because statistically, things are a certain way, but that's not a good thing for our society. And so we need to essentially we need to focus on fairness versus statistics. And I think that's a fascinating thing. Again, what is the outcome? For medicine, you're focusing on that narrow circumscribed area. In all these other fields, whether it's translation, whether it's content moderation. And I think that was a fantastic point about, what are those algorithms? What are the principles that they are sort of encoded with? Even the use of profanity. That's one that there's a lot of struggle with of, what is a bad word to be used? If we think about it, and should profanity be banned? Within journalism, and this is, I think, what to me an interesting area in journalism, using any of those, those particular words in English was strictly prohibited under absolutely, even when you quoted someone, you had to mask those. Today, more and more tier 1 news outlets, that's actually allow us actually on the official list of acceptable vocabulary now. Not just in quotations, but in using themselves. So what do we do is we think about, and I think the other thing is AI systems, we tend to, at least historically, because of the cost of training them and the instabilities of incremental learning historically, you tend to sort of build these things. That's why when COVID-19 came out, a lot of the tooling didn't recognize the word COVID because they were trained before that, and there was not enough effort across a lot of the tooling to kind of add that vocabulary, to add that concept in. And I think this is the concept too, as we think about, in the sentiment world that I do a lot in, the word cool. It's fascinating to me that how many of these sentiment dictionaries that we use today were trained in the 90s and early 2000s. The word dentist, and this is, I think, again, something that we don't think about. The word dentist shows up in a lot of legacy sentiment dictionaries as an extraordinarily negative word, an incredibly negative word. Now, statistically, that's accurate. If you look at the text that is published, say, on social media, the word dentist is typically associated with a really negative connotation. People dread going to the dentist. But you have to then ask, is that fair, that's statistically accurate, at least within the particular training data that I am feeding it, that may be statistically accurate. But if we look across society as a whole, does that hold? Well, I don't have access to that. I can pull a Twitter stream. I can pull maybe some news data. I can pull different. But I think part of it is, what is the universe? Now, in medicine, again, you have a specific lens through which you look at people. We're constrained by the sensors, by the technologies we have to examine the human body. When we think about sociological data, what do I gather? Oftentimes Twitter is used because it's easy to get your hands on. But I think that's a fascinating challenge there of how do we access essentially the data to which we see is essentially, if you think of society, the data points of society only bubble up to these really tiny little things that are not representative of society. Those are the ones we tend to sample on. Maybe it is true that within the Twitter universe, the word dentist is highly negatively associated, but that's not fair to the dentistry world per se. That can have downstream societal implications. So I think part of that too is kind of thinking about, as AI applies into other fields, where are the societal impacts as well there?
So one of the things Kalev mentioned, which I think is extremely relevant, is I'm forgetting exactly what you said, Kalev, but there's data for everything. Now, you could argue that there is data for everything, and therefore that is a source of truth. But I would posit that that's not always the case, because data is a reflection of bias. Like, what are you collecting? Where are you collecting it from? Why are you looking at that subsection of humanity to collect your data? Because one of the things that was mentioned earlier was that there is a scientific bias for, or scientific basis for, why certain occupations are more predominantly male versus certain occupations are more predominantly female. Now, that kind of depends on when did you collect that data, and what was the situation in society. Did everybody have equal access at that point to everything? Did everybody start at the same baseline? So these are the things. The reason I bring this up is, this is going on a slight tangent, but the reason I bring this up is, this is the foundation of our data for AI. And AI, at the end of the day, is built by human beings. So it is going to reflect some of that. So it is up to us collectively as a society to figure out, where is bias going to help us. And one of the things Kalev mentioned was, for example, within a mortgage application, does bias have a place over there from a point of race or sex, or any of the other indicators that could negatively impact a person, regardless of what their means are? Or it should only be objectively looked at from the point of view of, what is your capability to take on this loan and repay this loan. There's someone else in the comments who also talked about, which was a great point, I thought, which is, what if medical data that you have is only based on the individuals affluent enough to get care? That's a great point, because you're seeing the data. The data that you're seeing is really tied to where you're looking at. What about the data that you're completely missing because they're not coming to light? Is there an active effort to go behind that and kind of find what you're not looking at, because there are misses over there, which is the reason why we're talking about ethics in AI and bias in AI. And collectively, our intent is good. We're trying to do the right thing, as long as we don't overcorrect ourselves. I think that's the main kind of baseline that we should all be thinking about. Like, what are we trying to solve? Why are we trying to solve it? What is the place of bias in it? Can it help or can it harm? Because it is just not going to be a single answer for everything.
Thanks for it's good to have this back and forth. First of all, Kalev, you brought up some an interesting, like, very articulate position, talking about language and bias. So you'd probably be of the school that language shapes society and not biology, and that if you can just make people say words in the right order and avoid saying wrong words, then you get good people out. That's a pretty extreme view. And the comment that was just highlighted a moment ago from Dan Stormont talks about equality not being the goal, and equity and justice. But I think he's talking about equity and social justice. And social justice is very different to justice. At least it's not the only school of thought in terms of justice. Should the mortgage example I don't know much about, but let's talk about insurance. Should medical insurance cost differently based on your race, your gender, your socioeconomic status, whether you live in a rural or urban area, what kind of work you do? Are you like a white collar worker? Are you gray collar? Are you blue collar? Should it be different based on that? Well, it is. Reality says it is. Can I charge different premiums for that? Well, not under the current law, no. At least not in many countries in the world, including I'm pretty sure including America, Australia, and Canada. I don't know much about other countries. So yeah, it's a real problem that insurance companies have to deal with. They have to, they're out for their shareholders, and they need to say, well, how do we increase profits and decrease risks? So they've got their own calculus to run, and you're taking variables out of their calculus, so they can no longer make a lower premium, and instead everyone gets the same high premium. And is that fair? Well, I guess. But is that correct? Is that an accurate reflection of reality? Or is your argument, we don't want an accurate reflection of reality, we want our utopian vision, and we want to merge all of society towards this utopian vision that we have articulated, and that is radical egalitarianism, and that's your vision, which is fine, but don't put the language of justice and language of science around it, because this is neither science nor justice.
I think really what the argument here, which I think is a fantastic one, is who makes those decisions? You think about health insurance in the United States. Historically, if you were a smoker, they were allowed to charge you more for smoking. That was not something that insurance companies came up with on their own entirely. That was something that the legal infrastructure of our nation weighed in on. So as a democracy, the people weigh in. I think ultimately one of the challenges, there's actually two fascinating points here. As Mallika said, I think one of the challenges is the data set. So about 15 years ago, we did a big project looking at understanding cultures around the world. There was a lot of interest at that point in certain sectors around how do we adapt a lot of these technologies. So one of the things that we did is we went out to all of the English language journals that were published. And so essentially what we did is we said, find me all of the highest rated journals within the academic world, within anthropology, linguistics, et cetera, covering the world. And we said, find us each region of the world and find us all those top ranked journals. And then we went through the authorship of all of those. And what was fascinating about that was it was all from top universities, mostly in the US and Europe. And when you start drilling down at the authors, there was, except for maybe a small number of them, there was no connection to the areas that they were studying. So these were, for example, a Harvard professor born in the US, born in great privilege, traveling to another part of the world, living there for a few weeks, maybe a few months, maybe a year, and then publishing the definitive book that governs that. Now, what was interesting there is those data sets then, those writings, those codification, a lot of these involve codifications of different things. Those are being used to train AI systems. But one of the challenges there is as we're seeing a greater understanding of data bias, people realize, well, wait a second, this doesn't reflect at all these societies. And again, as being half Estonian, I can say that things that were written about my country by American authors that that wrote about it, it bears absolutely no semblance of reality. But because they saw it through that Western lens, because they were born in the U.S., they did this ethnographic study. That was how they understood it. And what we're realizing is that we say, well, this is the academic world. You don't see that at scale, because I think this is a big thing. We say, well, at scale, these biases work out. Well, not if the entire corpus was constructed a certain way. But I think more to your point, and I think as Mallika pointed out too, I think really what this comes down to is who decides these things. So if you say about, for example, insurance, well, this and that and that, the point in all of that is that a democratic society had a vote. The people elect their representatives. Congress decided that, yes, it's legal for health insurance companies to charge more to smokers, or certainly was in the past. It is illegal for them to charge the following. Now, you could make any different type of statistical argument you want about that. The end result is the society itself was able to weigh in on that. And I think that's the fundamental difference here, is that when we talk about AI fairness, AI bias, who's deciding this? Well, typically it's companies that are operating on their own. It's companies gathering lots of data, or universities, depending on the group. But essentially it's technologists that are collecting the data, that are doing this. Societies don't have a way of weighing in on what do they believe is acceptable or not acceptable. If put to a vote, society might say, when it comes to glaucoma, we should be able to integrate these factors if those have a health outcome. When it comes to mortgage applications, that has actually come up on many, many occasions to a vote. And each of those times, Congress has decided, statistically, you may be absolutely accurate on some of these things, absolutely, but we're not going to allow that. For car insurance, if you are a young male, you are allowed to charge more as a car insurance company. Speaking as someone who had a very high premium because of that. But as a society, we had a vote on that. So our elected representatives were able to step forward and say, we accept this, we don't accept that, no matter what the statistics tell us. And I think that's the real challenge here is, how do we allow societies to have a vote in these things? As you keep referencing this utopia, well, if that's what society wants, then really the trick is, how do we restore societies having a vote in that?
Okay, this is a very lively discussion going back and forth, and I'm seeing we're getting a lot of questions coming in from the audience. I want to take the time to answer some of these questions coming in, and there's one directed to you, Kalev. Let me put this on screen. I think we need data democratization as a new norm to enable collaboration across domains, geographies, and much more. Of course, there are challenges such as data integrity, privacy, constitutionalization laws, etc. Any thoughts on this?
So there's a fantastic question. I actually have two answers to this. So one, actually I did a large report last year, actually on social media content moderation. And one of my recommendations there, sort of the core of that was to say, all of these algorithms that are being built, all of this work is happening in the shadows. We don't have access to that. And so my argument there was, yes, there's sort of the vague guidelines published, but especially as more and more of this is outsourced to AI systems, just simply seeing the training data, simply seeing the modeling code is not enough. We need to see the actual outcome of these systems. And so if we have models like Lumen for copyright infringement, where enough data is out there and scholars can get increasingly increasing access to that. What we need is something like Lumen for all of this, where we can see the outcomes of these data sets. And again, with all the privacy and all those different levels that are applied to that. But certainly imagine if every public tweet that was, say, deleted for content moderation, there was a data set accessible only to scholars, they could start looking at these type of bias questions. I mean, look at a lot of the things that have come up, with certain companies, with some of these very issues, like hiring, job wanted ads. Certain companies obviously had algorithms, had things in place that were not supposed to take these characteristics into place. But it was because outside scholars were able to mine the data, say, well, you know what, inadvertently, actually, you have this huge, you were systematically enforcing something here. So I think having visibility into that, where we have these public data sets for scholars to be able to dive in, to be able to ask these questions, to raise this awareness, so we as a society can dig into this. And then I'll say conversely then, along those same lines, in my own work, the Genome Project is all open data. And the reason for that is we collect this data from across, and we basically create all these metadata annotations to enable people to ask these very questions of, when it comes to, whether it's the pronouns that are used, whether it's, does the media refer to those and they and them? Is Europe part of us? Is Africa part of us? Is Latin America part of us? Is Asia part of us? And you see huge differences in how the media frames the world. And so I think the more that we have that type of data, in fact, Genome actually is used very heavily by journalists to raise these very issues, to explore, to actually say, look, this is what we see in this. As a society, once we see that, we can start having these discussions, but you need that data to undergird that. So to me, it's really about creating visibility so we can have these societal discussions about what we as a society want.
So there is another aspect in data democratization that's going to impact the outcome significantly. So you data democratization, it's mainly on the input side. You're either enabling users to be able to interact with the data or contribute to the data, and then if the end result over there, if you're working with AI and machine learning, then you're going to have some sort of decision making outcome at the end of it. Now, where the bias can creep in, or where the question of fairness really comes in, is how did the algorithm or how did AI come spit out the decision that it did? And is there some sort of way that we can make this transparent? Because as a human being, to an extent, I can say, hey, I chose that because of all of my foundational experiences dating back to my childhood, whatever, things I don't even remember. But with AI, we have a little bit more control. It is a challenging problem to solve. But if we are able to explain why AI made the decision that it did, then we will be able to detect what is potentially, is that a good decision, for is that a bad decision, depending on the use case. And then can we have this feedback loop where it can learn from its mistakes? Because at the end of the day, we have to be able to trust the process. And if the process is opaque, it's going to be a little bit harder to do that.
And that's fantastic. That's a fantastic point. Again, the describability and explainability of AI, once we have that, we can start having these societal discussions. Because I think at the end of the day, it's really about opening these up where societies themselves can have that can weigh in. I mean, because you think about it, again, as these tools are moving beyond, simple spam detection, even spam detection, you think about as these algorithms increasingly govern our lives, everything from, do we get the mortgage? Do we get this? Do we get that? We really, as a society, need to weigh in on these things. We need to be able to have that.
Like where is this going to head? If you want oversight, engineers writing AI algorithms without oversight, might make them pursue truth rather than the sociological dalliance of the day. It's like, whoop, sorry, my overlord, I accidentally increased my true positive rate. Sorry, it won't happen again. And Kalev, what you said earlier, not to be too in your face, but what you said earlier, well, if society wants something, then they can just vote for it. That sounds completely ethical. I'm sure that can, I'm sure that can't go anywhere bad. That seems like a really,
that's what a democracy is. Yeah. I mean, that's the end result. That is what a democracy is.
But we're talking about ethics.
The challenge really is the fact that AI is not subject to democracy at this time. Yep. AI is increasingly weighing in on society, and I think that's really where a lot of this tension comes in.
Kalev, you literally said if people vote for a medical diagnosis, then that medical diagnosis becomes true. If they say that,
I don't recall saying that. In fact, no, I did not say that.
You said like 7 minutes ago, if people agree.
I think, again, if we get back to reality, I think it really comes down to the societal impact. I think that's really what it comes down to, is societal impact. If we think about, something, for example, engine failure, we can say engine failure matters about temperature. It matters about these things. I think what the argument here that you're missing really is that when it comes to a narrow area like AI, society might agree. Yes, you know what? I think most folks in society might say, when it comes to a medical diagnosis, when it comes to something like that, maybe we want all these characteristics there. But when it comes to these broader issues of societal impact, I mean, who even has access to walk into your hospital and have medical treatment? Those increasing are AI algorithms that are deciding, okay, I've got glaucoma, I need treatment. All the stuff you're talking about is completely irrelevant if an algorithm says, you know what, we're not even gonna allow you to walk in and get that treatment because, you know what, you're gonna cost us a lot. That's, I think, where the challenge comes in. What you're talking about is kind of up here. Once all these other things are addressed, like I can walk into that hospital and be able to be treated. The problem is, it's now an algorithm that looks at me and says, you know what, I'm not even gonna allow you to be treated. I'm just gonna turn you away because of this and that. And I have no recourse, no appeal. There's nothing, there's just nothing. And I think as AI is increasingly reaching these parts of society, that's where we need that vote.
So you're worried about death panels that decide whether or not you achieve treatment because of, or you're 95, Do we really want to spend like $2 million on you just to get another 2 years of your life, or and that $2 million can be used
Democracy.
elsewhere?
I mean, mortgages. We say, you know what?
Because
Should
that
it really be an algorithm deciding that?
The whole idea of a death panel, like you see that in Canada, you see that in the UK, in very
I
socialized.
think, again, if we turn this back
field.
to AI ethics, again, I think the focus of this panel really is around ethics and fairness here.
So I think it's unethical to not use
it's a
bias
huge
in your
issue,
AI
I know
algorithm.
there's a lot there.
If you
but
can
again, if we kind of
emphasize the
turn it
bias
back to
in
the
your
focus
algorithm,
of this
then you
panel,
can increase the accuracy.
again, it comes back
and
to
less
democracy.
people will go blind.
It comes to
That seems like a
allowing
good idea.
people to have that choice.
Gentlemen, we only have 5 more minutes left. We got some interesting questions coming in from the audience. This is a very lively debate. Maybe we need to bring. Please vote if you all think we should do a version 2 of this topic. I do want to take a few questions. We got a direct question to Mallika from our student network. As a product manager, the student is interested in becoming a product manager in the future. AI is a very interesting topic they're very interested in going into. How do you manage an area that's still evolving, and what kind of skill sets or what kind of areas should they pay attention to? And when we talk about fairness and ethics, what areas should they explore further to develop those skills as a product manager in the future?
Whenever someone asks me this question, my answer is very straightforward. You have to start with the user. You have to think back from the user. Everything else falls into place. It's not about starting from AI or ethics or injecting AI into a place where it has no business being, or injecting something else. It's not about learning a field and then managing a product in that area. It's start with a problem you want to solve, and that starts with the user, and then you kind of work backwards from there and actually work on solving that problem. And at that point, you pick up a lot of other knowledge if you're really determined to solve the problem. It all starts with the user. If you start any other way, you're doing it wrong.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to take another question from Omkar Dash. When applying the lens of fairness on AI, there's a lot of subjectivity and biases that goes into definition of fair. Can there ever be a global definition of fairness? If not, are we heading into more centric world, specifically when it comes to the AI? So,
I'll take the first response, but I'm sure others will chime in. No, I think it's a terrible word. I don't think it has a good definition. You could define it as radical egalitarianism if you want, but I don't think that's necessarily fair. So obviously you can read the dictionary definition, but you won't get much insight.
I don't think there can be a global definition of fairness, because the global definition of fairness is evolving. What was fair in the 1900s would not be considered fair today. And who knows what's going to be fair, 100 years from now. So as long as we understand that the definition of fairness will continue to evolve, as long as that happens, then I think there can actually be a global definition of fairness.
Yeah, and again, working globally, the definition of fairness varies across the world. What we might see as fair in this country, another country, it really varies. I think, one of my greatest pieces of advice when I work in the content moderation field is companies try to come up with one set of rules that govern the world, and to understand where we are a very rich, diverse world. And really, that's where I always come back to. It really needs to adjust per country. And over time, you've seen companies kind of recognize that now. In fact, most large companies that do content moderation have now actually begun to localize across the world. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is allowing societies to have a say in that. Because at the end of the day, if we're building these tools in the service of society, we say, why do we build these tools? Well, it's in the service of society, then society should have a say in that.
Okay, awesome. All right, so we're at time. And once again, I really want to say thank you to all our panelists and the audience who's tuning in. We do have a survey set up for you. Let me see if I can pull this out. This is the link to the survey, goo.gle/BTB-survey. Please let us know how we did today, any feedback that we can take and apply to our upcoming series. And if you have other questions you want to send us directly, please send them to btbteam@google.com. And Mia, one of my colleagues, will try to respond it. And any feedback also, or if you're interested in becoming a panelist, welcome to send us a note as well. That being said, Kalev, Mallika, Sam, this was a very lively debate, very engaging. And I want to personally thank you all for joining, and looking forward to working with you in the future. So that being said,
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon. Take care all.